off already, forgotten. Good evening, everybody. Sorry for a bit of a delay, but we've got the streaming working finally, and it's great that you're all here with us at home with your cups of hot chocolate and your bickies to listen to Shem tonight. And Shem's going to speak to us on David and Goliath, God against the odds. Really looking forward to it. We'll just open with a word of prayer to God. Our loving God in the heavens above, we come to you at this time to praise your great name, for you are all-powerful and you are in charge of all the affairs of this world. We know that we live in chaotic times, and yet we are so blessed to be able to freely read your word, the Bible. And we ask that you'll be with all of us this night as we open your word, and be with all those, wherever they may be, that are searching for truth in this world that we live in. So we would leave tonight in your care and ask all things in Jesus' name. Amen. So I'll just hand over to Shem. Thanks. I'll just sit here.
G'day, howdy everyone. Welcome to our session tonight. I've got my phone here, so if you've got any questions, just put them on the WhatsApp. Just call me, and stop putting pictures of your supper up there as well, because we don't have any of it here. That was Mike's fault. Mike was meant to bring it. So tonight we're going to deal with the story of David and Goliath. So if you haven't heard of the story of David and Goliath, you've probably heard of things called the Goliath beetle, or just Goliath used in our modern vernacular, and it's used to give the term of something very big or something very large. So that's really what we're going to deal with tonight, and it's a really exciting story, one particularly Allegra in my family loves. So it's great to talk about it with you tonight. But I want to just give a little bit of context and build on from the Ruth story that we dealt with last week. Well, Phil dealt with last week. And we're going to pick up from Ruth chapter 4. It gives us a little bit of context about the story of David and Goliath. And we're reading Ruth chapter 4, verse 21. And Salmon begat Boaz. So Boaz is the one of the characters in the story of Ruth that Ruth obviously marries. So they then have a kid, and they call it Obed. And then Obed has a kid, and it's called Jesse. And then Jesse has a kid, and it's called David. And this is the same David that we're going to talk about tonight. So let's start with the story in 1 Samuel 17. So just to give a little bit of context, so we've moved from the story of Ruth. We're now a couple of generations later, and the children of Israel are a little bit more set up as a country. They've now got a king. Their first king is King Saul, and he's one of the characters in this story. And so they're a little bit more set up, they've got a little bit more structure, and they've also probably, departed from God, having God as their leader a little bit as well. And at this time, they have inveterate enemies, and the inveterate enemies that the Israelites have to always deal with is people called the Philistines. So if we look at our map, hopefully you can see this, and Nathan's onto it. But if we draw a map of the Middle East, there's Israel is in this area, Dead Sea, Galilee, Cyprus, and Egypt down here with the Nile. Then we've got, Syria up here, Turkey, Iraq over here. So at this time, Israel was mostly dwelling in the mountains, in the mountain ranges there, where you might know Jerusalem is about there, and Bethlehem is just a little bit below it. And the Philistines were living in the plains here, in the kind of greener areas. It's a little bit reversed of what we have currently in Israel. Currently in Israel, the West Bank here is mainly occupied by the Arabs, and this kind of plains area is occupied by Israel, other than the Gaza Strip just here. But so this is where Israel mostly is. This is where Philistines is, and at this time in the history of Israel, they're clashing all the time. And we read of one of these clashes in 1 Samuel 17. So if we read verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their enemies to battle and were gathered at Shochoh, which belongs to Judah, and pitched between Shochoh and Ezkah in Ephes-dammim. And then Saul, who we know is the king of Israel, and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they pitched by the valley of Elah and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And we read in verse 3, the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley in between them. So what we're reading here is that the Philistines have decided to go to war with the children of Israel. And they're coming up one of the valleys here, which is kind of the easy way to get into the mountains. You go up a valley, follow it up there, and you avoid all the hills. But while they're coming up the valley, Saul and his army set up on in the area. In the area to try and block them. So what we've got is the Philistines coming up a valley to go and see where Israel is. Saul and the children of Israel heard about it, so they rush down to block up the valley so they can't get there. The Philistines have seen the children of Israel, so they then, if we have the kind of, if there's a valley going here, there's a mountain this side, and there's a mountain this side. This is the valley of Elah, which actually is around here, and there's a mountain here and a mountain here. But excuse the maps. So the Philistines are then seeing the Israelites come to meet them as they're coming down the valley, so they quickly hop on a mountain. So there's a mountain here, valley, mountain here. So Philistines are up here, and Israel is up here. And you can tell, like, in those days, they don't have, like, missiles or guns that have long ranges, so they can't really touch each other. But no one wants to go down here, because as soon as you go down there, then they can just throw rocks at you or arrows at you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And you can imagine back in those days, you're wearing armour, you got a sword, you got a helmet on, you know, it's maybe 30, 40 kilos of armour, trying to climb up a big hill while people are throwing rocks down at you, throwing arrows down at you. No one wants to be doing that. And, you know, if they hit your friend in front of them, then he falls down and it then becomes dominoes. And, yeah, it's not very fun. So at this time, they're both on a mountain. There's a valley between them, and no one really wants to move. No one wants to budge. No one wants to go down into that valley because it's pretty well, you're going to lose if you move. The children of Israel also don't really... The other important bit about this is if the Philistines can get up this valley, then they can go anywhere on these mountains. And if Israel gets down this valley, then they can go anywhere down into the plains here. So strategically, it's really important not to lose this battle. So you prefer to take a defensive stance for much longer because the stakes are so high. So the Philistines try and set about breaking this deadlock. And in verse 4, we read in 1 Samuel 17, verse 4, there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. So 6 cubits and a span, we're told, is between 2.9 and 3.10 metres. So So on average, we'll say he's about 3 metres tall. So, if you look at a basketball ring, his head is touching the basketball ring. So he's a massive... In fact, if you got my mum and stood her on her head, he would still be taller than two of my mums standing on her head. That's how big this guy is. He is a massive guy. And you might think that, sometimes you see these huge, really tall guys, maybe like basketball players. I think some of the tallest basketball players in the NBA at the moment, like Taco Fall, is only 2.2 metres, which is still, you could sit on his shoulders and you're about the size of Goliath. So Goliath is a massive person. But often when you see these really tall people in basketball, you're like, oh, he's so gangly, he's, like arms all over the place. He doesn't have much coordination, he's not going to be very strong, so, he actually probably wouldn't, even though he's really tall, he actually wouldn't be that hard to beat. But we're given a little bit more information about Goliath. We're told not only his height in verse 4, but in verse 5, he has a helmet of brass on his head, and he's armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass upon his shoulders, and the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. So Goliath, if we take all the kind of weight of the defensive stuff he's got on him, historians tell us is there's a big range. They say it's between 50 and 100 kilos worth of armour that he's wearing at the moment. So if we say it's 75 kilos, that is a huge amount of armour. And then we read about his spear. So his spear is a weaver's beam, and the spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. So we're told, historians tell us, that the spear's 600 shekels of iron is between 6 to 8 kilos. And Mike, I was talking about it with Mike earlier, he reckons, so a weaver's beam, they reckon, is around 5 centimetres diameter, and it would have to be about 3 metres tall, because that's the height of Goliath. That in itself is around 10 kilos, and the head of iron of the spear is 8 kilos. So we're talking 18 kilos worth of spear here. It's a small child, and he has to throw that, to get anywhere. And as well as this, he's got a sword, which we're told later about the children of Israel, that at this time only Saul and his son had a sword. So swords really were like cutting edge technology, particularly at this time with these people. And he's got so much stuff on him that he's even got a guy in front of him who's holding a shield. So not only is he 3 metres tall, but he's carrying 100 kilos worth of armour, weaponry, and all that type of thing. So he's a unit. This guy is a tank. We'd probably call him Abraham if it wasn't so confusing. He's that much of a tank. And he's got armour just all over him, got a helmet, shin pads, everything. He is one built guy. So when he comes out and says, send one of your best fighters against me, everyone's going, well, I'm not sure about that, because he's got so much defence, he's so big, he's obviously massively strong. And this is what the Philistines send out to kind of break this deadlock that we've got here. And what do we read about it in verse 8? So he stood and cried. So Goliath stands up and he cries to the armies of Israel and says, why have you come out and set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you and let him come down to me. And if he be able to fight me and to kill me, then we'll be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man and we'll fight together." And understandably, when Saul and all the Israelites heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So the Philistines sent out this champion. They're like, "We're going to break this deadlock. We've been here a while. Let's break this deadlock. We'll do a one-on-one fight. That will sort out this fight, and we'll go home from that." So this happens, and we read later that this is happening for some time. It's happened for about 40 days, I believe we read later on in the chapter. So at these times, battles typically were fought in summer and spring, because if you can't fight in winter and autumn because it's too wet and everyone's running or horses and they all get bogged down. So typically it's in, when the weather's good. So we've taken up 40 of these days. So that's almost 30% of your possible fight time is taken up, just sitting here staring at each other. And you can understand as Goliath comes out more and more often and he gets more and more confident, the children of Israel get more and more afraid and more worried about what's happening. And they also wake up every morning thinking, "Are we going to fight today?" No, go back to bed. No, we're not going to fight. Wake up the next day, we're going to fight. Then no, we're not going to fight. The anticipation of this would have been terrible for the people at the time. And this happens for 40 days. Then the story breaks off a bit more and we read about David in verse 12 of 1 Samuel 17, verse 12. "Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse." So Jesse is his dad, and he had 8 sons, and the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. So he's an ancient in the days of Saul. Jesse is an ancient, and he was one of the kind of ruling families, you would say. And the 3 eldest of the sons of Jesse followed Saul to battle. And we read that their names, 3 sons that went to battle, were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. So prior to this time, David had actually been working in the palace as a minstrel, and he had been playing instruments and music for Saul. But at the time that the battle was, Saul didn't need the minstrel, so he was sent home back to his dad. And we read in verse 15, but David returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So David's left the palace, goes back to his father's house, and his dad says, "Go out and look at the sheep." And the Philistine, then reading verse 16, "And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself for 40 days. So understandably, they don't have Twitter to update their parents with what's happening, or even a phone at these days. Battles didn't normally go for this long, so Jesse's getting a little bit worried, so he sends, or actually probably Jesse's wife, probably more to the fact, is getting quite worried, so he says to David in verse 17, "And Jesse said to David, Take now for thy brethren an ophah of this corn and 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge." So Jesse's tell David, "Go down to the battle, here's some cheese, here's some bread, hopefully it's not mouldy by the time you get there, give it to them, and find out how your brethren are, and then come back." And we read in verse 19, "Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines." Well, they're not really fighting, are they? They're more in a stalemate at the moment. Verse 20, "And David rose up early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench, and as the host was going forth to the fight, and shouted for the battle." So the armies, for Israel and the Philistines, they put the battle in array, army against army. So David arrives sometime in the morning, and the fighters are getting up in the morning, and they're like, oh, we're going to fight today. Let's get ourselves in the right position. Let's, probably have a seat because we know we're not going to go down into that valley, and probably, let's see what's going to happen today. Verse 22, we read, David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran to the army and came and saluted his brethren. So David is too young, obviously, to be a fighter. That's why he's back at home. He's got, so 3 of the oldest are in the war, and David's the youngest. So that leaves 4 other brothers who are probably still too young to fight. And then you've got David. So David is quite young at this stage. The Bible seems to indicate that around 20 is when they went to fight. So you would say the 3 oldest are older than 20, and then you've got 4 who may or may not be, probably younger than 20, and then you've got David. So I don't know how old you would say he is, but he's between, 18 to 12, that type of age. He's quite young at this stage, and he gets there, and they're all getting ready to fight. They're getting ready to get in their position, and he's like, oh, well, let's see what's happening here. So he goes down, as most boys of that age would be interested. He goes down to find what's happening, what's all this noise. They're getting in array, and also to speak to his brethren. Verse 23, he salutes his brethren, and as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out to the armies of Philistines, and spake the same words, and David heard them. So this is the same as what's been happening for 40 days. Both armies have gotten ready, got on their mountaintop. It's a stalemate, so Goliath's like, oh, come on, I'll take you on. And he starts yelling as David is talking to his brethren. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the men, fled from him and were sore afraid. Or other translations say they hid from him. They probably didn't flee, they stayed on their mountain. But they were definitely, their anxiety, their fear was obvious at this stage. And the men of Israel say, have you seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel he's come up. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. So hi Dan and Alana. So he's come up, everyone's running away. And then David's like, oh, what's happening here? So the men of Israel say, this is Goliath, he's been saying it, and if someone kills him, they're going to marry a princess, they're going to marry the king's daughter, and they're going to be free, so they're tax-free. So Saul, the king at this time, had kind of done all the bribes he could to try and get someone to fight against this man, Goliath, but still, no one wanted to do it. Understandably, this giant of a guy who's an absolute tank. And verse 26, and we read, was David scared? Well, not really. And David spake to the man and stood by him and said, what shall be done to the man that kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So this time this verse kind of reveals the mindset of David and why he isn't afraid, because he's saying, well, this is a Philistine. How is he going to defy the living God? I know he's 3 meters tall. I know he's carrying, 100 kilos at least of armour on him. And he's, absolutely, seemingly invincible. David saying, well, we've got the living God on our side. Why are we afraid? And verse 27, the people answer him and saying, so shall it be done to the man that kills him. So, all these good things that Saul had promised. And Eliab, the eldest brother, heard heard David speak to these men, and as all good brothers were, they get pretty annoyed with their younger brother when they're trying to get involved with the big boys. So Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, "Why have you come down hither? Who have you left the sheep with in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for you have come down to see the battle." So, as a big brother, he's like, "What are you doing here, David? Get back to the sheep. Who's looking after the sheep? You're just here to come and see the battle. You're being a sticky beak. Off you go." As most big brothers give their younger brothers pretty short shrift. And David says, as most younger brothers says, "What have I done? What's the problem? What's the problem here? What have I done?" His dad had sent him, so, he thinks he's in a pretty good position. And then he turns, verse 30, David turns from Eliab and speaks to another person after the same manner. And the people answered him. And eventually, verse 31, we read that David spoke to enough people that eventually Saul got wind of this. And he heard that there's this Israelite who wasn't afraid of this giant of a guy. And so Saul sends for him. He's like, "Oh, sweet, there's this guy who's happy to fight. I want to hear more about this guy." So we read in verse 32, and David comes to Saul and he says to him, and David says to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Don't be afraid of Goliath, thy servant, or I will go up and fight this Philistine." So David volunteers to go and fight this. He's not afraid, and Saul says to him, you can't go against this Philistine to fight with him because you're a youth. You're too young. And he's a man of war from his youth. So he's much older, much more experienced in the ways of battle and the weapons he's got. You're just a young kid. What are you going to do against him? And David says, "Thy servant, or I kept my father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he's defied the armies of the living God." So, Saul says to David, "Oh, you're too young, you're too inexperienced, you shouldn't fight this guy." And David says, "Well, yeah, I haven't fought any battles, but I've killed this bear and this lion at one stage," which isn't an idle boast. To kill a lion with, a stick and a sling, that's a fair effort. And it seems to, and Saul recognises that, and he seems to be won over. But David goes on, and verse 37 he says, "The Lord's delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear. He'll deliver me out of the paw of, or the hand of the Philistine." And Saul says, "Well, go, and the Lord be with you." He hasn't got any better options at the moment, has he? And he's not real happy to go down and face this guy. We read about Saul, actually, that he's head and shoulders above the Israelites at the time. So Saul isn't a little guy, but even he's not happy to go and fight this giant of a guy. And Saul says, "Well, God be with you, God be with you." And verse 38, Saul armed David with his armour, and he put a helmet of brass on his head, and he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded the sword upon his armour. So Saul's sword, Saul's given him his armour and his sword, so David puts it on, and he essays to go, or he wants to go, but he decides not to because he hasn't proved it. And David says to Saul, "I cannot go with thee, for I've not proved them." And so David puts them off. So David comes to Saul, says, "I can do it." Saul says, "All right, don't have any better options. Here, I'll at least give you some armours. I'll give you a fighting chance. Here's my sword. Here's some armour, and God be with you." But David goes, "Well, actually, he puts it on. And he's like, "Oh, this is not what I'm used to. I'm not comfortable with this." So he takes it off, and Saul's a bit taken back. Something we can take from that, though, just a bit of an insight into David. David is young, We're told he's a youth, and he can't go to war because he's too young, and Saul calls him a youth. But he does fit Saul's armour. He doesn't not take Saul's armour because it doesn't fit him. He takes it because he hasn't proved it. And Saul, we know, was head and shoulders taller than most of the Israelites at the time. So David is young, but he's a big dude as well. He's not a small person. He's not a teeny weed at this stage. Yeah. Mike is saying it's a bit like me wearing his clothes, Like I would fit his clothes, but I'd feel I hadn't proved them, so I wouldn't be able to wear them. And one other thing we're told earlier in 1 Samuel 16, when the prophet at the time went and visited the family of David, he sees Eliab, who is David's older brother, and he's a big, strong guy, and he thinks that he's a big, strong guy, and the Bible tells us that he's a big, strong guy in 1 Samuel 16. From these indications, we're getting the thought that David is young, but he's actually he's not a skinny weed. He is a kind of a big dude as well. But he decides to face this Philistine without all this armour. And what does he do? He takes off this armour. He's not scared of this Philistine at all, doesn't even need armour to face this guy. And verse 40 we read, and he took a staff in his hand, so he's got a bit of wood, and he gets 5 smooth stones from the brook, puts them in his shepherd's bag, which he had in a scrip, and a sling in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So say, Saul, no, don't need this armour, don't need this sword. I'll just go in my shepherd's clothes, and I'll just take this stick with me and a few little stones and a sling, and let's see how I go against this guy who's been training for war for all his life. He's completely, dressed in armour. He's got no chinks in his armour, and he's 3 metres tall, and he's an absolute tank of a guy because he's carrying 100 kilos of armour on him. And he says, yep, no, I'll go. But we know why he does it. He's not stupid. He goes because, like he says to Saul, I believe in God, and God will keep me safe. And so in verse 41 we read, and the Philistines, so Goliath, came on and drew near to David. So Goliath's been sitting out there all morning. He sees someone come to him, so he goes out to meet him. He's like, finally, I'm gonna fight this guy and kill him, and we can be done with this battle. And as he draws near to David, and his shield bearer draws near, verse 42 we read, and when the Philistine looked about, he's like, and he sees David, he disdained him because he's a youth and ruddy and of a fair countenance. So he disdains him because he's a youth and a redhead as well. He mustn't think much of redheads and a fair countenance. He mustn't think much of fair countenances either. And we read verse 43, and the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with staves or with a stick? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field. So Goliath sees this guy come to him, and he's like, this is the best you've got? You've only got a stick. What are we going to worry about that? But, oh well, come to me, and I'll kill you, and, the birds will eat you, and the beasts will kill you, and we'll be done with this. And then we can all go home. And what's David's answer to this? We read, what was it? 45, we read, then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day will the Lord deliver me into your hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and will give the carcass of the host of the Philistines this day to the fowls of the air and the wild beasts of the earth. And all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saves not with a sword and a spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he'll give you into our hands. So at this stage, David answers the Philistine and says, you've got a sword and a spear and a shield. It doesn't actually matter. Because on my side is the God of the armies of Israel, and you've defied him, you've blasphemed him, and because of that, you're going to die. And I will it's not going to be me who the beasts of the field and the birds are going to eat, it's going to be you. And all these people will know that it's the God of Israel, really, who is in control. Because David knew in himself, didn't he? He looked at Goliath and he knew this guy is pretty much indestructible. And he looked at himself and he knew that he's just a youth, There's no way this should work in the real world, that he should ever win. But he places his reliance completely on God. Verse 48, and it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran to him and he put his hand in his bag. It's a bit weirdly written. I would have had that stone in my sling well before I started running to him. But anyway, he starts running to him, puts the stone in his sling, he slung it, and smote the Philistine in his head. And the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So this Philistine had shin guards and breastplates and armour everywhere and a helmet. He just forgot this little space on his forehead. And David slung the stone, smacked it in his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. Is that better? Hopefully that's better. No worries. Oh, just like we're right on the brink of the story here, Mike, and you've just taken us away. Oh well, end of the story. Goliath's dead. It's all over. Verse 51. He got hit in the head. Verse 50. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he smote the Philistine and slew him, but there's no sword in his hand. So David ran up to him, grabbed the sword. The shield bearer, I don't know what he's doing, he must have run by now, but he's not interested in looking after Goliath now. He grabs the sword, so it kind of means that David, he can carry this sword, he can hold this sword. He's not a little guy himself, and he cuts off his head. And the end of the story is the Philistines saw their champion dead, fled. Men of Israel chased them, pursued them to the gates of Ekron, and they won the day. They went down this valley, all into the land of the Philistines, and kind of dealt with them there. And they took the spoil from them. So they were victorious. And Saul, in verse 55, so the king kind of, remember how he's promised his daughter to the person who kills Goliath? So he's a bit like, verse 55 we read, and when Saul went forth to fight against the Philistine, he goes to Abner, the captain of his host. Whose son is this youth? So he's like, oh, this guy's going to fight him. If he wins, whose family is he actually? Let's make sure I know this guy. Kind of, he knows him because he plays music for him in the palace, but he doesn't. He's like trying to work out this family connection and just make sure this marriage is actually going to work out. And verse 57, David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, and Abner took him and brought him before Saul, and the head of the Philistine in his hands. And David says to him, I'm the son of the servant of Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And that's really the end of our story. It's a David and Goliath story, as our modern vernacular is, it tells us about David and Goliath story. It's someone who faces insurmountable odds and seems to wins the day. But we know why he won, don't we? And David tells us why he won. It's because the God of the armies of Israel was with him. And that's really why this story is in the Bible. God doesn't put the story in there to tell us about, some ancient warrior who lived 4,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago. And this, he doesn't really care. God doesn't really care about battles that happened. When the Bible misses out lots of battles. The reason this story is in there. Bit of suspense while I have a drink. The reason is because there's a hidden meaning behind it. There's a parable that God wants us to take out of it. And the parable is God is saying to us that there's going to appear Goliaths in your life. There's going to appear people who just, and problems which seem insurmountable. There's going to appear things in your life which you're going to look at and you're like, there's no way I can overcome that. There's no way I'm ever going to be able to defeat that in my life. And God's story, God's message to you here in the story of David and Goliath is, if you trust in me, anything's possible. If you trust in me, the God of Israel is with you. You can defeat anything in your life. And, that's really like something that's kind of facing us at the moment fairly starkly, isn't it? The Goliath, I guess you could say, in our life at the moment is, the coronavirus. And we look at the coronavirus and it seems inevitable that most of us are going to get it. We're currently in lockdown. The economy is in meltdown. We're all shut in our house. And it seems no way we can kind of, overcome this problem. But really, the coronavirus is just one of the many faces of mortality that we have in our life. One of the many faces of that we're going to die at some stage in our life. Everyone dies. And this coronavirus pandemic that we have at the moment is just another of God's example that we are mortal. We're going to die. We're going to fade away. And God says to us that we can overcome that if we trust in Him. He offers us life eternal if we trust and rely on Him and believe in His Son. This, insurmountable problem that we have in our life of mortality, all the modern drugs, all the smartest people on the world can't defeat this problem of that we're going to die. But God sent His Son to save us so that we could live and we can have everlasting life. And just one other thing I just want to take from this story as well is that we have Goliaths in our life. We have massive problems in our life. We have insurmountable problems that seem that they can't go away. And God has these problems. He has these trials that He puts in our life. And when we pray to God and when we speak to God, when we read in the story of David and Goliath, God didn't take Goliath away. He didn't. The people would have been praying to him to how we're going to defeat Goliath, but He didn't just magic Goliath away. Goliath stayed there and He challenged them. And that's really how God works in our life as well. If we have big problems in our life, big issues, challenges in our mind, whether they're mortality, whether it's loneliness, whether it's, whatever it might be that we struggle with, God, when we pray to God, God doesn't magic them away. He doesn't necessarily take them away, but he does give us the strength to overcome them. And that's what we find in our life as well. That we do have these big problems in our life, and God puts them there. Some of them are put them there deliberately to show to the people around us, this is how God acts in this way, and to be an example to others about how God, and to develop our character. There's a common sailor's saying that good sailors are made in storms. They're not made in the calm seas. So God puts trials, tribulations, big problems which seem insurmountable in our life. He doesn't take them away, but he does give us the strength to overcome them. And he says, rely on me, as in rely on God, not Shem. God is saying to us, rely on me, and if you trust in me, in the end, ultimately, we can overcome all problems which appear in our life. Thank you.
Well, on your behalf, I'd like to thank Shem very much for his excellent presentation tonight, and he's really just summed it all up and explained it all so well. I've sort of got nothing else to add to it, so thank you very much, Shem. Next week we'll be doing the same thing. We'll be streaming, so make sure you all tune in again next week at 7:30. And next week we've got 7:45, so I'm sure we might even do a 7:28 and surprise you, so let's get on the couch early. Next week we've got Tim Dean going to come and speak to us on someone even more amazing than David, the most amazing human ever to live on this earth, Jesus. So that should be a great night. And just another note, I hope everyone's noticed the planning Josh went to with the tallest chairman and the shortest speaker, so we can get sort of into the whole David and Goliath theme going. So, yeah. And after we've finished, we'll probably have a little reenactment in the car park. All right, well, another announcement that I must remember now that everyone's home a lot more, they've got more time on their hands. No excuses for not tuning in on Sunday nights at 8 o'clock to Coast FM, 88.7 FM, and you can hear Tim Colliver. He's an awesome speaker, talking about many different biblical topics, and I highly recommend it. We'll then bring tonight to a close just with a word of prayer. Once more, our loving God, we come before you and we thank you. We thank you for your word. We thank you for your plan and purpose. We thank you that you are still calling out of this world a people for your name. We do live in times of fear and anxiety. But as Shem has explained to us tonight, we do have hope and we have comfort in you. You are interested in us and you are calling us to be part of your family. So help us to continue to read your word as often as we can, that we might grow in our knowledge of you and of your plan and purpose with this earth. So go with all of us, guide us and guard us and direct our steps each and every day. Be with all those that are sad and sick and lonely, those that are without food. We know there are so many in this world less fortunate than we are. And help us in this difficult time to always think of others. And we leave our lives now in your care and we ask all things in Jesus' name. Amen.